Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain, and I'd like to welcome you aboard and enjoy your flight.
17-year-old Juliane Koepcke and her mother boarded Lanza Flight 508 on Christmas Eve 1971. Little did they know they would soon become part of one of the most tragic aviation events in Peruvian history, and Juliane would live to tell the tale of one of the most remarkable stories of survival humanity has ever seen. Everything seemed ordinary at the airport, the hustle and bustle of travelers, the sound of announcements over the loudspeakers. As she boarded the plane, she felt confident and excited to see her father when they landed. She stored her luggage in the overhead compartment, took her seat, and held her mother's hand. The flight took off without a hitch. Her mother hated flying, but she was calm and collected. The first 25 minutes of the flight were normal. They got their meal packs and drinks served. As the plane continued on to its final destination for the evening, the clouds hit. Juliane recalled the dark billowing clouds looking like living creatures as they moved outside. At first, they didn't faze her. They should have. At 10,000 feet, the plane entered into the heart of the storm. Rain pounded the windows, visibility was non-existent. Lightning started illuminating the creature-like clouds outside. Juliane started realizing this wasn't good. Fear started creeping in. As she looked over to comfort her mother, she saw an immensely bright light, then darkness, finally followed by a glow on the wing of the plane. It had been struck by lightning. They were going down. But Juliane's story doesn't start with a plane crash. Let's take a step back. Juliane Koepcke was born into a family of renowned zoologists, and from an early age she developed a deep love and appreciation for the natural world. Juliane got her willpower from her father, making it to South America when he was a young, broke biologist as a stowaway on a ship. He had a dream to research in the jungle. He then crossed the continent on foot until he made it to Peru. That's where Juliane grew up. Her parents were working at Lima's Museum of Natural History when she was born. At the age of 14, she left Lima with her parents to establish the Panguana Research Station in the Amazon rainforest, where she learned a variety of jungle survival skills which would end up coming in handy. They went into a nearly vertical nosedive. Next thing she knew, she was outside the plane. The air gushed by at incredible speeds. She couldn't catch her breath. As she noticed she was still in her seat, the plane was breaking apart around her. Her chunk of plane began to spin through the open sky, hurling towards the earth. She still couldn't breathe. The last thing she remembered before she lost consciousness was the forest canopy spiraling towards her, a deep green ocean sprawling endlessly and getting closer as she fell 2 miles to the earth. For 19 hours, she drifted in and out of reality. When she finally woke, she was still strapped to her seat. She was drenched and covered in mud. It had rained all through the night. It took a moment, but when she finally gained some clarity, she realized what had just happened. That she had fallen from the sky and was alive. With a major concussion and swelling, she couldn't see out of her left eye at all. The vision from her right was just a slit. On top of that, she had lost her glasses and only had one sandal left, in a miniskirt. Regardless of her majorly impaired vision, she looked around her, and although her mother's seat next to her remained, her mother was not there. She was completely alone. Composing herself as best she could, she assessed her injuries. She had a broken collarbone, a torn ACL, a partially fractured shin, a strained neck vertebra, and several deep cuts on her arms and legs. But nothing was bleeding badly, and she felt surprisingly little pain. As she was still too shaken to walk, she began crawling on all fours, calling out her mother's name. As she slowly crawled, some of her jungle experience was playing its part. She marked trees as she moved to track her path. She noted all of her surroundings. For 4 days, she wandered the jungle alone, looking for any signs of people, of civilization. In the distance, she heard a distinct sound. She remembered the king vulture from when she'd encountered them during her time at Panguana. She knew one thing for certain. She knew they flocked to death. Following the sound, she eventually came upon another row of seats with 3 dead bodies. Their bodies had been driven into the soil like bullets. Only their legs and feet were visible. Even though she knew her mother had been seated next to her, she recognized one as a woman. She had to check. Grabbing a branch, she pushed the body's feet over. She noticed painted toenails. Her mother never painted her toenails, and she breathed a sigh of relief. It was around this time that her watch quit working, frozen on December 28th. Amidst the background noises of the jungle, one sound penetrated her consciousness. She heard a slight trickle of water and eventually found a small stream. Growing up raised by two biologists meant Juliana knew this area of the jungle contained over 500 species of trees and as many, if not more, plants. There were over 400 species of ants, 130 species of mammals, and nearly 100 species of reptiles, many of which were as hungry as Juliana herself. She used a stick to poke the ground ahead of her and check for snakes. She chose to walk in the water of the stream to minimize her risks. She knew the water still contained threats, but she marched forward. Again, her experience with the animal kingdom as a child saved her. Fading into a thoughtless march forward, Juliana then heard the call of the hoatzin. She remembered that this bird nested exclusively near open stretches of water, areas where she could be found or maybe find civilization herself. She immediately changed direction and followed the bird's call. It led to a full river. For the first handful of days wandering, she could hear the sounds of planes and helicopters above. She knew they must have been looking for her. In fact, it was the most extensive search in Peruvian aviation history. However, by this time, those sounds had stopped completely. Juliana figured the search was called off. Feelings of deep despair and abandonment took over. Juliana and her mother had been glad that they were able to get that flight so that they could celebrate Christmas at Panguana with her father. They had waited until last minute on Christmas Eve to get the flight so that Juliana could make it to her prom. Although they were also a bit worried and anxious because Lanza had 2 other crashes recently. The airline had a checkered history during its decade-long run. By this time, Lanza had 1 single plane in their entire fleet. It ran 2 routes. Due to scheduling mishaps, there was only time for 1 flight that day. It ended up being Juliana's. She hadn't eaten anything, although she knew she was surrounded by Heart of Palm, that she could get pure, fresh water from a certain type of liana. She simply had no tools, no way to get to the sustenance surrounding her. She continued on. One of the cuts on her upper right arm had begun to annoy her. Upon inspecting it closer, she noticed movement. The constant harassment of flies had resulted in some laying their eggs in her open wound. The eggs had hatched into maggots. They had eaten deep into her skin. She couldn't get them out. She floated down the creek once walking became too exhausting. Along the banks, she encountered countless crocodiles. They would jump into the water in her direction. Yet she knew from Panguana that their threat was minimal. She remained calm. She was most worried about the stingrays in the river. The nights were hard. She would find a location where her back would be sheltered and covered herself in leaves. She would struggle to sleep, either being eaten by mosquitoes or frozen by relentless rain. Her apathy grew, her thoughts shut off. She mindlessly floated down the river, at times hallucinating and hearing things. Being on the river, she no longer had the protection of the tree canopy. The sun was brutal. She eventually began bleeding from second-degree burns on her back. On the 10th day, in a total haze, Juliana drifted to the river banks. She laid down, ready to give up. Then she noticed something out of the corner of her eye, a small boat on the shore. Was she hallucinating again? Dreaming? Dead? She touched the boat and it felt real. No one was around. She then noticed a small trail leading away from the water. She followed it. By this time, Juliana was so weak that the 9-foot-high embankment the trail led up took her hours to ascend. She simply had no strength left. But the effort was worth it. There was a small hut, still no people, but shelter. Once again, her intuition and experience came into play. She remembered a time when her father had removed maggots from the family dog's wounds using diesel fuel to force them to the surface. The hut had some gasoline, and by pouring the gas over her right arm, Juliana was able to remove the suffocating maggots. There were 35 in total. She sheltered in the hut for the night. On the 11th morning, she was still alone. It was raining. She was near death, and she stayed put. As night encroached once again, voices emerged from the jungle ambiance. She dismissed them half out of apathy and half knowing her mind was playing tricks on her. But then, 3 men emerged. They were shocked by what they saw. A shriveled young white girl in the middle of their hut in the jungle. That night, the men stayed with her and dressed her wounds as it was too late to leave. In the morning light, they set off. Taking the boat Juliana had seen earlier, they headed downriver for 7 hours, eventually reaching a lumber station with more supplies. The station had a local pilot, and he flew Juliana to the nearest hospital. She was finally safe. She was met at the hospital by her father soon after. Neither of them could speak when they first saw each other. While still recovering in her hospital bed, Juliana gave authorities as many details as possible in hopes of finding other survivors, or at least their bodies. On January 12th, searchers found her mother's body. Worse yet, her mother's body was in much better condition than would be expected had she passed away in the crash. It was assumed her mother had survived up to 2 weeks after the crash, unable to move, unable to look for help like Juliana had. Juliane Koepcke had fallen 2 miles from a breaking apart airplane. She survived a harrowing jungle escape and made it out alive to tell the tale. In the lonely night she passed in the forest, she said to herself, "If I survive this, I will make something important for humanity and nature."